Well, welcome everyone to the Botany Bistro. I'm so glad you were able to join us for lunch. We are coming to you live from Cincinnati, Ohio at the Civic Garden Center, which is located in Avondale. We would love to have you come and visit us. It's been a little bit hot the last few days, but we did just have a nice rainstorm, and so it's cooled things off a little bit. My name is Mary Dudley, and I'm the Ecology Education Manager here at the Civic Garden Center. And I started Botany Bistro just as a way to keep in touch with all of you and share some of the amazing details about plants that botanists notice. And if you've ever been on a walk with a botanist, you'll know that we don't get very far, constantly stopping to point things out and just appreciate all of the complexities that we see in the natural world. And so today we're actually going to be celebrating our 5th session. So if you've been able to join us for our previous sessions, welcome back. If this is your first time, then there's lots of ways you can get caught up if you want to check out some of our back issues. We will post the video to YouTube, and so you'll be able to see it in an archive. Our first 3 sessions discussed the basics of botany, and we discussed some famous historical and current researchers. Last session, we started off our plant morphology series, and we're going to continue that today. And so today we are picking up where we left off. We talked about leaves and roots last time, and today it's flowers and fruits. So I'm very excited about today. Plus, there are so many beautiful flowers in the garden right now. This one's as big as my head, hiding behind our hydrangea. But we just have so much diversity in our floral world, and so we'll be talking about that today. At the end of the session, I'll open up the chat, and so if you have any questions, you can bring those up. Anything that you'd like to share, we would be happy to hear that. So be sure to stay till the end and we can chat. All right, well, now that we've done our introductions and our recap, I would like to tell you what's on the menu for today. So hopefully you're all enjoying something delicious for your lunch. Here at the bistro today, it's just some salad, just a little fruit salad for me today. It's been, like I said, very hot. So there's not a lot of heavy things that I like to eat during weather like this. But this is very refreshing. So I've got some pineapple, and I have some watermelon with me today. I also have a vegetable that I'm going to be eating, and it's this beautiful purple cauliflower, especially since we're talking about cauliflower. Now for this, I am going to soften it up a little bit and put it into a dip, but I just wanted to show you what I'm snacking on today, and I hope that you're all enjoying your lunch as well. So let's go ahead and jump into our flowers. We're going to talk about shapes and parts. We're going to talk about phenology and fruits. And just to look ahead, in 2 weeks, on August 11th, I will be discussing plant anatomy. And so that's going to be looking into plant cells and what's going on inside the cells, the organelles inside the cells, and also tissue types. And so we won't be talking about what goes on underneath the surface very much today, even though there's a lot going on, especially with our flowers. We'll save that for some future sessions. But plant morphology, if you're not sure, is basically the study of the external parts of plants. And for a long time, that was all researchers could rely on exclusively. Now we have very highly skilled technicians that run microscopy programs that are very useful. We also have DNA sequencing, and so we have different ways now to look at plants, but morphology really is the foundation for plant identification as we have known it up to this point. And so knowing a little bit about morphology will help you a lot. And so if you want to take a peek back at our session about leaves and you want to try some of that out, I definitely recommend it. It's a great way to identify plants, especially in this current season that we're in. Here in Ohio, we have lots of things leafing out. Our leaves are just maybe starting to think about changing color and dropping off, but we've got several more weeks before that happens. So it's a good time to use your leaf ID and brush up on it. And flowers are a really wonderful way to identify plants as well. It's actually been widely accepted that flowers are more of a reliable characteristic for specific plants because the reproductive parts of plants that the flowers hold tend to be more uniform within that plant. We mentioned last time that leaves could be larger in a shady area. They could be less variegated as well. And so the leaf characteristics are a little bit more fluid than the flower characteristics. They tend to be pretty steady. And so we'll talk about those. Flowers are actually modified leaves. At some point in the plant development, there's a hormone signal that tells the plant to stop producing vegetative growth and start to go into the reproductive flowering phase. And so that's where we get our floral growth. And so that's really interesting. The first part of the flower that develops is the sepal, and then the petals, stamens, and pistils. So we're going to be throwing a lot of vocabulary out today, and so feel free to, do a little searching on your own, take some notes, but there are quite a few terminology pieces that we'll use in our talk today. And so let's start with just thinking about the form of the flower. And we're going to use an idealized flower, talking about think about a lily. The lily is got lots of big floral parts, and so they're pretty easy to identify. And they also are in the monocot group, and so they have parallel venation, and they are just a good model species. Whenever I'm doing flower dissection with students, high school or elementary or even adults, I usually go to Peruvian lilies, and so they usually have those in the store. They're one of the least expensive flowers you can buy, but they are very good for first-time dissection and identification. And so most of us are familiar probably with the petals, right? That's the pretty part that we notice. But there are also something that protects the bud before it comes out, and those are going to be our sepals. Sometimes those are green as they're budding, but there are other times that the sepals and the petals can be almost indistinguishable from each other, and they both carry very decorative pieces. And so that's the only hang-up that my students usually get when we're dissecting our lilies, are that those, it's just hard to tell them apart. And so in those cases, we might call them tepals, put together the petals and the sepals, and mash that up into the word tepals. But we know about our petals and our sepals that are covering up that bud before it opens. And then inside we have usually a male and female reproductive parts of the plant. And so the female reproductive part is called the pistil, and it includes the stigma, the style, and the ovary. And it will be important to know later when we study plant physiology about how that pollination and fertilization process happens. And so I'll be digging deeper into the ways that flowers actually move pollen around in that session. But for today, like I said, we're just kind of looking at the external pieces of plants. So we'll focus on those different parts. Now, the stigma is usually in the middle, and it's a little sticky on top, and that's where the flower would like the pollen to land. And then it can travel down the style and into the ovary. And within the ovary are ovules, and within those are eggs. And so flowers actually do have eggs, and pollen actually does have sperm. And so if that's something that's new to you, that's pretty interesting that we can draw a lot of parallels for other organisms in our environment. But we'll stick with kind of the big picture today. And then the male reproductive parts are the stamens with the anthers and the filament. The filament is the stalk that holds the anther, and the anther is the part that holds the pollen. So if you've ever really dug your nose into a flower to get all of that wonderful fragrance, and come up with a little dusty something on your nose, that's going to be that pollen that's coming off of the anther. And so on a perfect or complete flower, it is going to have both male and female parts. But there are other flowers that are not perfect, we would say, they're imperfect, or incomplete. And so they do not have both of those parts. So we do have separate male and female flowers occasionally on plants as well. But we're going to kind of go with that complete flower for now as we discuss it. So you're thinking about a lily, you're thinking about these large, beautiful petals, and you're thinking about the different pieces that are on that. When you really get up close to it, you're going to be seeing that there could be a fork at the top of that stigma. And so then you're leading into that ovary. So this is where I usually get my hand lens out and maybe a sharp knife or a razor blade to be able to cut into that ovary and actually look at those ovules. And knowing how many parts of that ovary are existing is a neat way to correlate to fruit development. And so I'm thinking about like a bell pepper has those, kind of sections. You section out the bell pepper. Maybe it has 4, maybe it has 3. Those are actually a result of how that ovary is arranged and how that fruit then develops after it has been pollinated and fertilized. And so we see all of these consistencies together. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself with fruit. So let's go back. We'll zoom back out on our flowers. When you are thinking about identifying a flower, it is important to look at the different parts that we've mentioned, but also just taking a look at the whole flower and thinking, what is the shape and what is the symmetry? And so when you're looking at flower symmetry, you have a couple different choices. Typically, flowers are either going to have bilateral symmetry or radial symmetry. Radial symmetry is going to be something like a crane's bill or a lot of our flowers are radial symmetry, so like sunflowers, something that's like, okay, I could cut this in any number of angles and I would have symmetrical sides. Whereas your bilateral symmetry, you really can maybe in the middle, and then you can have 2 mirror sides, but they are not going to be symmetrical all the way around. And so a violet, for example, would have bilateral symmetry. If you want to get fancy with some other terms, zygomorphic is another term for bilateral symmetry, and actinomorphic is a term that we use for radial symmetry. So, like I said, lots of vocab today. And so thinking about the symmetry is important because it will help you kind of understand what parts of those flowers are doing what functions. For example, if you are going to have a petal that is modified in a way so that it's fused, it might be a little bit harder to say, oh, okay, how many petals are there? Fused petals create tubes, typically, and those are all developed in conjunction with a specific pollinator in mind. Flowers are very good at attracting specific pollinators. And so these different characteristics of color and shape and smell are all designed to attract that pollinator to it. Whereas fruits, the main job of a fruit is to disperse the seed and protect the seed as it develops. And so the plant isn't doing all of these wonderful things for us. We are good pollinators, but they didn't really develop with us in mind. And so it's beautiful to see the diversity of the plant world and think about all of the different things that that plant is supporting as it grows and forms. And so we've got our symmetry down. Let's think a little bit about shape. There are over a dozen different shapes of flowers. The more you look, the more you'll find. But we do have some kind of common ones. I was talking about lilies before. We call those stellate. And so they've got kind of those larger petals. Their sepals are very similar to their petals. We call those tepals. And so they can, you can tell them only apart, the sepals and the petals, by where they attach to the flower. And so the sepals are going to be on the outsides and the petals will be on the inside. And so that's one form. We also have funnel forms, kind of like trumpets. That would be like your morning glory family, and they have fused petals together. We have daffodils, which are coronate or crown-like. Campanulate have bell shapes, and so there are campanula flowers, and now you see where that name came from, that shape. We have some that are more like, they're saying that they look kind of like butterflies. I don't know if that's a stretch or not, but the pea family has some very interesting shapes. Papillonaceous is the name for that form. We also have tubulate, and so those are going to be, the corolla is going to be a little bit more skinny than the funnel form. So like I said, there's just so many different terms that you can find, and so every flower has its own little shape, so make sure you're paying attention to how that shape looks. So we've got our symmetry, we've got our shape, and one thing I wanted to tie back to were those pea flowers, and how we had discussed before in session 2 with our historical botanist, Gregor Mendel did a lot of genetics work with peas, and one of the 7 characteristics he was looking at was the flower shape, where it was held onto the plant, and also the color. So he was looking at 2 different flower characteristics when he was running those experiments. Pea flowers are also edible. So in my fruit salad today, I definitely could have thrown a couple in there. They're so delicious, and they taste really wonderful if you've never had one. And so thinking about our shapes will also determine the types of pollinators that are attracted to that flower or able to pollinate it in any way. If you have a tube-shaped flower, you better have a beak that can match that. If you have a flat flower, that's going to be a lot easier as a landing pad for larger butterflies, moths, things like that. We're not going to talk a lot about pollination syndromes today, which is what we call those relationships between what types of pollinators visit what kinds of flowers. That will go more into our ecology section and thinking about how plants interact with the other organisms in their environment. But if you want to look more into pollination syndromes, it's really fascinating to think about the colors of flowers that we can't see because we don't see light on the UV spectrum like our bees do. And so there are lots of flowers that create nectar guides on their petals that are invisible to our eyes, but looking at them under a UV light, you can actually see that the flower has turned itself into a target. And so there's, oh, come in the middle, this is where the nectar is. And when that pollinator is getting that nectar, it's able to brush up against those stamens and get the pollen all over it. So it's very, very cool, very complex. So another thing I wanted to talk about after we've looked at kind of the basic flower shape is how that flower is formed in possibly a group or in a singular way. So we talked about with our leaves, for example, that sometimes what you might identify as a single leaf is actually a leaflet and part of a compound leaf structure. And so a lot of times in our flowers, they are not singular. They're actually part of a larger inflorescence, we call that. And inflorescences, surprise, surprise, have lots of their own names and shapes as well. You can have spikes, you can have racemes, panicles. There's all sorts of different ways that these can be arranged. And so thinking about flowers that are common in our area, let's think a little bit about our Apiaceae. We'll talk about some of the carrot family. And so a lot of us probably have seen Queen Anne's lace, and they actually have something called an umbel, and they're compound umbels, and they create these secondary rays and these bracts that create that kind of flat-looking flower surface, but it's composed of so many different flowers together. Understanding if it's a singular flower or if it's a group of flowers is vital if you're going to be making proper ID. And the way to do that is similar to how we did it with our compound leaves and thinking about the petiole and how the petiole is the part that attaches to the branch and has a swollen base. On our flowers, they have pedicels, which is the stalk of an individual flower, and a peduncle, which is the stalk of an entire inflorescence. Peduncle is just such a fun word to say, too. And so there can also be little bracts, leaf-like bracts, that kind of surround the pedicel. And so some inflorescences are single-flowered, and in which case the pedicel may also be regarded as the peduncle. Solitary inflorescences can be terminal at the top. So let's think about the state flower for Ohio, which, if you don't know, is the trillium, the white trillium. And it's a single flower, it's large, and it has a terminal solitary flower. So we would call that a single inflorescence. Whereas the other trillium that we can see in our woods is sessile. The sessile trillium has a variegated leaf, a spotchy leaf, and the petals are maroon, but they are not on any kind of stalk, and so that's why that sessile word is there, and it's lacking the pedicel. So thinking about the different parts and the different ways that the flowers are arranged is important so that we can really see what is happening as well with our flowers. So let's talk a little bit about a food or important economic crop. And so that is going to be sunflowers. We use sunflower oil for lots of things. People have used sunflower seeds as dyes for many generations. It's a really wonderful protein source. And it is important to understand how that flower looks and functions in order to get a good crop. So I have not a large sunflower here, but I do have some flowers that are in the Asteraceae, which is the same family as the sunflowers. So I'm going to hold up one of my black-eyed Susans here. And there are actually hundreds of flowers in my hand right now, even though it looks like I'm only holding one. And so these are composites. And within composites, there are flowers we call ray flowers, and the flowers that are on the edges are those ray flowers, and they typically will produce a single petal, and that attracts that pollinator. It's very bright, screaming, "Here I am." But those flowers on the edges are typically not fertile, and so they're sterile, and they just are there for the attraction of the pollinator. Whereas the flowers that are fertile, that want to be pollinated and fertilized, are on the inside, and we call those the disc flowers. They're not flashy and showy. They don't have those big, bright petals, but at the same time, those are what are going to develop into the mature seeds if they are fertilized. And so over time, it'll be interesting to see this flower in my hand because I can tell just from looking at it that we do have some active blooming disc flowers. The ray flowers are doing a wonderful job. They're screaming out hello. I can tell I have some sepals on the bottom, and so those are green, and they used to cover that bud up before it bloomed. But right in the center of my disc, I have some flowers that are not yet open. And so as these flowers continue to open, the cone center of this flower will grow. And then as the flowers around the edges are pollinated and start to die back, the cone will actually increase because those ovaries are now growing. They're protecting those seeds and making them mature so that they can grow new plants. So very interesting to think about. A pretty common plant that we all enjoy, but it is not what you think at first. So these are really, really fun flowers to dissect, and your homework actually is going to be to dissect a flower carefully. And so if you can take a knife or a razor blade and cut into the center of this, you would be able to see all of the different flowers and where they attach. And it's just a really neat way to get closer and deeper into that secret world of plants. There are definitely oddballs, lots of plants that don't read the books. One of my favorite plants that comes up in the spring is Jack in the Pulpit. And Jack in the Pulpit isn't necessarily a showy flower. It is in the arum family, and it has an upright spike, which is called a spadix, which is surrounded by a bract called the spathe. And so that's a little bit different, but it is a really interesting flower to think about because it is dioecious. And there are things we need to think about in our landscape because, for example, if you want to have a good seed set or a good fruit set, you have to know if your plants are monoecious or dioecious, if they're able to self-pollinate, or if you need to have another individual. So for those of you that have tried to plant your yards and you have been very excited about that pawpaw tree or that holly bush, it's wonderful to buy the specific type that you want, and you're very, I have room for this one plant. And then maybe the person at the nursery tells you, you need to have two. And you're like, okay, well, let's think about that. Why would I need to have two? Some flowers cannot self-fertilize. It's better to have a mix of genetic material, and so that is a safeguard against having the same material recycled in the same plant. And other plants have this dioecious monoecious. So I've said these words a couple times now. Let's figure out what they mean. Dioecious plants are plants that have two houses. And so on a particular plant, they will only have either male or female flowers. Monoecious means that they have both male and female flowers on the same plant. Now that doesn't mean that they will be self-fertile, but it does mean that you will have both pollen and access to the ovaries on a single plant. Dioecious means that some of the flowers are only containing male parts, like the pollen, or only containing the female parts. And so they are imperfect flowers because they do not have all of the organs, both male and female organs, and they're found on separate plants. One example of a dioecious plant is ginkgo. And ginkgos have those beautiful fan-shaped leaves. They have wonderful fall color, and so it's a really wonderful plant. However, the berries that are produced by the female plants are super stinky. And so people particularly want male ginkgo trees because they don't want to have those berries around. Now another option are bushes, some bushes that we like to have those little red berries. And so we might not be able to have those berries if we don't have a male plant somewhere. So if we're really seeking a good fruit set, we also need to have that pollen available somewhere. And so you really want to do your homework when you are planning your landscape so that you can understand how many and what types of varieties of plants that you will need. Now that being said, something interesting about ginkgos is that it has been found that if there are no female ginkgo trees in a certain radius, a male tree can become a female because the goal of that plant is to produce offspring, right? Is to have some kind of seed. And in order to do that, it will change its physiology and become female, so that once, kind of just over there street tree, this ginkgo, it was never an issue, and all of a sudden it starts producing these stinky berries that smell like garbage, which are delicious, by the way. If you can get past that part and you can open them up, it's a really unique taste, that ginkgo fruit. But yeah, pretty interesting there. But that's what I mean by monoecious and dioecious. If you are interested in flowers, and if this type of discussion is something that you want to dig a little deeper on, I would ask that you donate some of your knowledge and time to becoming a citizen scientist. The concept of bloom time is a very important indicator for farmers, for gardeners, to think about how we can care for our plants in the best way. And so that is called phenology, not to be confused with phrenology, which is like the study of the bumps in your head. So phenology And since 2007, climate change researchers have engaged volunteers in something called Project Bud Burst, and it's run in partnership with the Chicago Botanic Garden. You would get on Project Bud Burst, and you would create an account, and then you can upload information on different plants that are blooming in your environment. And so there are thousands of volunteers across all 50 states that are working on this project and helping track different bloom times for over 250 species of plants. Now, you don't have to be an expert to do this. You can start with just one or two, but all the data that is received is really valuable as we track climate change and figure out how to adapt to these changes that we're seeing in our environment. All right, well, that was really wonderful. Don't forget your homework is to dissect a flower carefully. Make sure that you're being safe, especially if you're using sharp tools. But let me review those flower parts before I let you go so that you can make sure that you know what you're looking at. And so flowers typically have 4 main parts. Not all flowers have all 4 parts, but most of them that we will be seeing in our beautiful bouquets do. And so that first round that you come to are those sepals, which tend to be green, but like I had mentioned with the lilies, not always. They can almost look like petals. But you'll come to that first round, and that was used to close and cover the bud before it emerged. And then the next layer that you see is the petal layer. And so those are going to be typically brightly colored. And so you'll move on past that. The third layer that you'll find are going to be the male parts of the plant, which are the stamens. They have the anther and the filament. The filament is holding that anther up, and that's where you're going to be finding your pollen. Now, the fourth and final inner layer are typically going to be your female reproductive parts. And so that is the pistil, which is consistent of the stigma, the style, and the ovary. And so that would be a complete or perfect flower that has all 4 of those parts. You might not find all 4 of them in the flower that you dissect, but I encourage you to really get in there and see what's going on with your flowers. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope to see you back in 2 weeks when we'll be discussing plant anatomy.